Move just for a second.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. You are currently watching the Future of MDMA Therapy panel at Mapping the Mind conference, which was supposed to take place in Canada, but now, of course, is taking place virtually. My name is Shelby Hartman. I'm the editor-in-chief and founder of Doblin. It's a magazine covering all things related to the psychedelic movement. And today we are joined by Rick Doblin, who is, well, that's his chair you're looking at. He just ran away, but I'm sure he'll be back momentarily, as well as Anne Wagner, Ben Sessa, and Pedram, Dara. I'm going to get a little bit more into their bios in a second, but first I want to just give you kind of an overview of Mapping the Mind conference, what it is, and where the proceeds are going. So Mapping the Mind is an annual psychedelic science conference that aims to raise funds and awareness in support of psychedelic research. This year, proceeds from Mapping the Mind 2020 are being donated to MAPS Canada and will help fund a study on psychedelic therapy for eating disorders. Eating disorders are among the most challenging mental disorders to treat. Furthermore, mortality rates for anorexia nervosa are the highest of any psychiatric disorder. Traditional treatments for eating disorders are relatively ineffective, and there is growing evidence that psychedelic-assisted therapy could be effective in treating this population. This phase 2 study, led by Dr. Adele Lefranc, will look at the potential of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat anorexia nervosa and bulimia, and it will have 3 sites, 2 in Canada, Toronto and Vancouver, and 1 in the USA in Denver. Conference attendees are able to donate directly to support this study through Crowdcast by using the donate button at the bottom of the screen. After the discussion, there will be a Q&A, and you can submit your questions by using the Ask a Question button. So I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the panel. If you want to just drop your questions there or drop them in the question feature, we'll get to them at the end. Hi, Rick. Welcome back.
It's my pleasure to be back. I was just telling my son, who's friends with Pedram, that,
that's amazing.
Because he happens to be here just for a few more minutes. Our son is visiting, but I'm back.
So just again, a quick bios and introductions for everyone. Starting out with Rick. Of course, you all know who he is. He's the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Studies. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His undergraduate thesis at New College of Florida was a 25-year follow-up to the classic Good Friday experiment, which evaluated the potential of psychedelic drugs to catalyze religious experiences. He also conducted a 34-year follow-up study to Timothy Leary's Concord prison experiment. Rick studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof and was among the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. His professional goal is to help develop legal contexts for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic therapist. He founded MAPS in 1986 and currently resides in Boston with his wife and dog and empty rooms from 3 children, one of whom is in college and 2 who have graduated. Thanks for joining us, Rick.
My pleasure.
And
by the way, I should say that my son in college has just subscribed to Doblin, and he didn't even know that we knew each other.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Glad to hear that. Anne Wagner. Anne is a clinical psychologist and treatment development researcher based in Toronto, Canada. Anne is the founder of Remedy, a mental health innovation community, is an adjunct professor at Ryerson University, and was one of the investigators of the pilot trial of cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD plus MDMA. That's a mouthful. Looking forward to talking about it. She is leading the MAP-funded trial of cognitive processing therapy for PTSD plus MDMA, and an upcoming larger trial of CBCT, a couples therapy for PTSD plus MDMA. Anne has done extensive work with communities impacted by HIV and collaborates on projects with LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS organizations, and trains and supervises students in evidence-based PTSD treatment and couples therapy, and provides consultation and training to other providers learning these treatments. She is certified as a facilitator of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Thanks for joining us, Anne.
Thanks, Shelby.
Okay, we're almost halfway through the bios here, folks, and then we're going to get to the questions. But these are all such wonderful people. They deserve a little context. Ben Sessa. Ben trained at UCL London, graduating in medicine in 1997. He works clinically and academically in Bristol and at Imperial College London University with an interest in the developmental trajectory from child maltreatment to adult mental health disorders. In the last 10 years, Ben has been a study doctor and a test subject, administering and receiving legal doses of pure LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, and ketamine. He is currently conducting in Bristol the world's first clinical study using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat alcohol addiction. And in the coming year, his Bristol clinical psychedelics team are planning to expand their repertoire to include psilocybin-assisted therapy, DMT-assisted therapy, and a medicinal cannabis dispensary. He's also a co-founder of Breaking Convention, which you should all attend, and the chief medical officer at Awaken Life Science Incorporated, a UK and European-focused company dedicated to integrating psychedelics into mental health care. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Pedram Dara. Pedram Dara was a participant in an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial for PTSD. It says here, it all started at the age of 19 when Pedram left his home country, family, friends, and everything he owned and loved to take control of his destiny. He traveled the world from east to west, country by country, and after 2 months, he finally arrived in Canada as a refugee with $50 in his pocket and a few words of English in his head. After struggling with chronic PTSD for 15 years, Pedram was chosen as the only participant to receive MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD legally in Canada as part of a phase 2 research study conducted by MAPS. So let's get right into it. And I guess we'll just start out with Anne. Can you tell us a little bit about the programs that you are developing at Remedy?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So Remedy really developed as an idea to be able to run psychedelic research. And with this idea of bringing practice and research together in the same place, because oftentimes those things are divorced from each other, right? So research often happens in universities or in hospitals, and then clinical practice happens in those settings, but oftentimes outside of them. So my hope was to bring those together and bring the great minds who are actually delivering the therapies into the context where the research is. So we've been running for about 2 years now here in Toronto, and now we do everything virtually. For the time being during COVID. And what we've been doing is developing this protocol that we're hoping to run as soon as our COVID restrictions lift for cognitive processing therapy, which is a type of treatment for PTSD that has really good evidence on its own without MDMA. And we're adding MDMA to it to see if this adjunct of these two therapies or these two interventions that on their own have a lot of efficacy, if you put them together, could you have even greater results, different results in different domains? And one of the reasons behind that is because CPT, that's the short form for that treatment, is really widely used in a lot of healthcare settings. So there's already a lot of healthcare providers who know how to do CPT. And so if we can demonstrate that you can put that with MDMA, we're kind of a step ahead in terms of having people be able to deliver that treatment when MDMA becomes legal. So that's one project. And then the other project that we're developing comes off of the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, which is that mouthful that you said earlier. So CBCT is a short form, is a couples therapy for PTSD. And that's really, my heart really lies in the couples work and the relational work with MDMA, that the ability for folks to heal together and be able to address what's happening in their relationship alongside whatever else is going on in their worlds. In this case, it's PTSD, is really powerful in terms of being able to have care and growth, not just for the person with PTSD, but also for their partner and therefore their community and their family and beyond that. So we had run a pilot trial in South Carolina with Annie and Michael Mithofer and Candace Monson. And that trial had really compelling results, even with only 6 participants or 6 dyads in it. And so right now we're in the midst of building out a protocol to run a much larger study to test it on a grander scale. And so we're really excited that that will be the next project after CPT plus MDMA at Remedy. And yeah, that's basically the start of this what we're hoping will be the home of a lot of further research and as well as training for folks. So we're excited that we'll be able to bring that to Canada, bring that to Toronto in particular, and have that be our home for that work there. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing at Remedy.
Wow, that's a lot. Sounds amazing. Like you're doing some amazing work. In the couples therapy, do both people in the couple get MDMA, or how is that structured?
They do, yeah. And so, theoretically, I really find it's important that both people in the treatment go through the whole process together, right? So it's not just the person with PTSD who's the client or the one who's being focused on. It's actually the relationship. And so that means that the whole therapy, like all the psychotherapy sessions, the MDMA sessions, the integration, everything is together. And I think that's a really powerful piece of the work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, we'll get into that more later. I'm going to just turn the mic over to Ben to tell us a little bit about what he is currently working on with Awaken Life.
Okay, hi, thank you all for having me. So my first confession to make is I'm not really an academic. I've never considered myself an academic. I found myself stuck in academia 15 years ago because the compounds I wanted to work with clinically could only be accessed through research. So I'm through and through a clinical doctor, and I want to be working with patients, but I've had to force myself to hang around boring places like universities for the last 15 years in order to use the medicines I want on my patients. So what I'm doing now, very excitingly, after all this work in academia, is opening a clinic, and have set up this company, Awaken Life Sciences, and we are opening Europe's first psychedelic clinic in Bristol in the UK. We will be delivering psychedelic therapies outside of research, starting with ketamine, because that's kind of all we have at the moment as a licensed medicine, to add MDMA and psilocybin as soon as we can. But we want to kind of get ourselves established as a psychedelic therapy center. So we don't want to be swallowed up by this conglomerate of ketamine treatment centers. We're not a ketamine treatment center. We're a psychedelic therapy center that happens to only have ketamine on the books, to add the others as soon as we can. And then the other things we're doing is we're going to have a little small research unit to actually run research projects and hopefully bring in small teams to do research through our department. And the third thing we're going to be doing is psychedelic training for therapists, which again is a bit of a strange situation because at the moment you can only really train as a psychedelic therapist if you're doing a specific protocol for a research study. So MAPS will train you to do MDMA for their studies. Compass Pathways will train you to do psilocybin for their studies. But what we're going to do is we're going to create this big bottleneck where in a couple of years, when these drugs come online and are available, the only people available to deliver them are going to be the few dozen people around the world who happen to have been lucky enough to do studies with them. So I think there's a lot to be said for getting hundreds, if not thousands of therapists trained now, even though hypothetically they can't actually work with these compounds because they're not licensed yet. So we've got a lot of work to do in the next few years. We're really excited about this. And for me, it feels like sort of 15 years of work is coming together into a clinical program that I can actually deliver for my patients.
That's so exciting. Congratulations, Ben. In terms of how you're setting up Awaken Life, I thought it was so interesting. You said you're trying to sort of distinguish yourselves from the conglomerate of ketamine clinics, because I think a lot of ketamine clinics are getting into ketamine in the hopes that they're going to kind of lay the foundation or have the infrastructure in place already for when MDMA and psilocybin get to market. So in terms of how you're setting up the clinic there, how do you set it up differently to sort of differentiate yourself as a clinic that is poised to take on these other medicines?
That's a really good question. In some ways, it's as simple as just using the word psychedelic. We talked about this in a board meeting the other day. Do we put the word psychedelic above the door? And we do, and we're going to. And an analogy I use is, if you look at, say, Botox clinics that came out 15, 20 years ago, when they first came out, no one wanted to use the word Botox because there was stigma attached to it. And they were called things like facial rejuvenation centers and stuff like this. One brave clinic called themselves the Botox Clinic. And then sure enough, within a few years, Botox wasn't a stigma. And these guys are now top of the Google list for, running Botox clinics. So that's our thing. it's part of it's as simple as from the day one, we're branding ourselves as a psychedelic therapy center. We're not going to be scared to use that word. But I have to admit, and sorry if there's ketamine enthusiasts amongst us, ketamine really is not my number one choice of a psychedelic agent by any means. But it's kind of all we've got at the moment. So we're going to call it a psychedelic therapy center, but it's only going to be ketamine for the time being. And as soon as possible, we can add the much more exciting compounds.
Yeah, Ben, would you say that there's another big reason that you can distinguish yourselves, which is that you'll be providing psychotherapy with the ketamine, not just here's the ketamine and it'll fix you and we don't need to talk to you? And
no, absolutely. And I call these ketamine infusion farms. And, I think that people that are just infusing ketamine and just saying to the patient, oh, I'm sorry, you're going to feel a bit weird for a couple of hours. Don't worry, it'll pass. And then you can get on your way and enjoy the antidepressant effect of the ketamine. I think they're missing a trick there. I think we want to learn to work within the ketamine psychedelic space and actually combine this with psychotherapy. So it is a psychotherapeutic protocol. And the ketamine is an adjunct in the same way we might use psilocybin or MDMA.
That makes a lot of sense. Pedram, I want to turn the mic over to you because I think that that's a good transition talking about psychotherapy and integration. And I mean, so you participated in the MAPS trial. What was the integration process like for you afterwards, and how have things been going?
Well, it was all going well until the coronavirus. I gotta admit, that was definitely something that impacted me because I want to be raw and honest. I know there's a lot of positive talks about it out there about the benefits, but I think the one thing that I could bring to a panel like this is also the risk or what didn't work or what kind of support was needed. So I really want to make sure that at least I'm addressing that. So for me, I kind of started integrating, and I think I'm still integrating. It's really hard to say if there was an end to it, but there it came, the coronavirus thing, and I feel like that was one of my major relapse. I wasn't ready for it. I was still in my kind of like bubble of this therapy work, and then I feel like it just came like a hammer. So I think the first few weeks was really hard for me. But one thing I want to kind of mention is that what this study gave me essentially was a set of tools to live my life. Like I used to see healing because this study kind of had like an end date. I somehow thought by the time the study ends and healing is an outcome, I realized healing is a process. So I think even right before this talk, I still did the abdominal breathing that my therapist was teaching me, right? So like these are tools that I took away for life. So although I had my relapse, I had really a few really hard weeks, I was able to remember some of the insights. I went back reading some of my notes. I watched some of the videos that I had recorded, and I started remembering that space again. So I'm happy to report I'm back online. So this is something that I think I take for life with me. So although I'm outside of the study settings, I got tools to deal with life now.
That's great to hear. We're happy to have you. And will you tell us a little bit more about when you participated in the trial and how you came to discover it?
Yeah, definitely. It was towards the end of 2018. And 2018 was kind of like the worst year of my life, I can admit, where just everything just spiraling downwards, right? So I became completely suicidal. And one of those days where I was just like, almost no hope left, just to distract myself, I started browsing and I suddenly see this article, I think it was from Vice. It was talking about how MDMA is helping people with PTSD. And I was like, somehow I just click on it. I don't even know why. I'm just starting to read. And then it was listing all the symptoms. And I'm just like, one by one, I'm like, I have this. Like, by the time I get to the end of the article, I'm like, maybe I have PTSD. Like, I had no idea. I was just suffering in silo. I just thought I have depression. That's as much as I knew about the mental health world. I'm like, I'm probably just depressed. And this is the first time I'm actually like, okay, what is this? I just click here, click there. Next thing you know, I end up on the study website, and then I suddenly look and I see a phone number that was actually a local Montreal phone number. And they were like, oh, they're looking for participants, and this is the only site. And I happen to be living in that city. And next thing you know, I'm just calling up this number, and then like out of desperation, of course he's not answering. I leave a message. I'm like, I'm pretty suicidal. I got no hope left. I just learned about this. I wonder if this is what I have. Can you help me? Like, And I hang up, just thinking that, oh, I'm probably called the psychiatric hospital. What if they're going to show up with white coats and take me away? I have a daughter. Like, I started panicking. And I'm like, I hope he never calls me back. Story short, thankfully, the therapist called me back 2 more times before I answer. And then we start talking. And then, one thing, I think it was 4 or 5 different interviews over the phone. And then he finally said, come to the office. And this all happens, I think, in 2 or 3 days. I show up to the office, 4 hours, we talk. Obviously, they ask me hundreds of questions. And then by the end of it, they're like, yeah, you're pretty in a pretty bad place, honestly. But, we're just looking for one participant. We just finished our training, and we actually have to do a real case study so that MAPS certifies us. And we're just looking for one participant. And I'm like, really? Like, what are the odds that I'll be that one? So I actually walked out of the office feeling like someone told me I have cancer, except that it felt it was cancer in my soul. So I wasn't actually feeling any better, Actually, I started feeling like, oh, fuck, like, this is really serious stuff, right? So somehow I didn't lose hope. Somehow there was a little bit of light left in me. So I followed through, and this process took, I think, from November until mid-January. And, obviously Rick knows how rigorous this process is. I think it's harder than getting green card for United States. By the end of it, one night, I think the therapist just called me. He's like, guess what? You've been chosen as the one. And we're going to have the first experimental session like in 2 or 3 weeks after that. And it was like, so that 3-4 months was very hard. And then I think just from there onwards, I got very interested in this project, because my background is in technical work and project management. And for once in my life, I realized my life became my biggest project. And actually, I went from being in denial to being interested. I was like, oh, let me actually learn more about this problem. And, and then obviously I started watching Ben's TED Talk, Gabor Mate. I dived deep into, I read Michael Mittelfer's protocol, 80 pages. I don't even think my therapist read all of it. I read every single word of it. By the end of it, they were like, I think you know more about this stuff than we know. There was not a single MDMA video on YouTube that I didn't watch. I went all the way into it. And I think that's probably had a lot to do with the positive results that I received. I became interested in my own healing.
Thank you so much for sharing. And that is a lot of reading. That's very impressive. Rick, last but not least, I know you can talk about an infinite number of things, but today it's MDMA therapy. Can you tell us a little bit about, you just raised $30 million, which is so exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about what are you going to do with that money, and where are you at currently with the final phase of MDMA research? Give us the latest.
Yes, thank you, Shelby. So we're going to be spending that money basically over the next 3 years. And we anticipate, if all goes well, to have FDA approval sometime probably early 2023. We're talking about a new psychedelic science conference that would be in April of 2023, probably in Denver. We'll probably get 10,000 people or so. Hopefully, Ben and Pedram will all come. And what we want to do is sort of talk about the new world post-approval. Now, of course, we can't guarantee it's going to be approved, but what we're going to be doing with the $30 million is that we have, for our phase 3 studies, we've already negotiated with FDA in what's called a special protocol assessment process. And so we've come to agreement on the design of the phase 3 studies and all the other associated studies that they want to see. We have to do hepatic impairment studies, food effect studies, some more animal neurotoxicity studies, various different things. And so we hope to we're going to have a major turning point coming up in a month from now, which is that we have to do 2 phase 3 studies. So Pedram was in the what we called the open label phase 2 study for the final step for training the therapists. And then we give them feedback, and then they move into the double-blind study. And so we agreed with FDA that we would do 2 100-person phase 3 studies. And FDA said that they thought that we could prove efficacy in smaller numbers than we need to prove safety. So they want to see the full 100. And so in March, we had the interim analysis where it's like our data monitoring committee takes a sneak peek at the data and sort of compares your actuals with your hypotheticals that you used for the statistical power calculations. The hypotheticals are really based on phase 2. but you still are guessing your best, and then you put it into what you think is phase 3. So the interim analysis in March delivered the best possible news, which was that we didn't need to add anybody to the study, that we had a 90% or greater probability of success with at least the medium effect size. There's only one drug other than MDMA that the FDA has declared a breakthrough therapy for PTSD, and that was a drug called Tonmya by Tonix Pharmaceutical Companies, and that was a repurposed sleeping pill from around 30 years ago. And that particular drug was in phase 3, had breakthrough. They had their interim analysis in February, and they failed for futility, meaning that there was no signal there. No matter how many more people they added, it wasn't worth it, and they invested well over $100 million on that idea. So we've got the breakthrough therapy was great, but then what happened was COVID and the shutdown and lockdown and all of this. So FDA approached us and also other sponsors who were well along in their studies and said, because of COVID, we're willing to negotiate with you. Do you want to end the study earlier? And that's a risky thing, because the more subjects you have, the more likely you are to get statistical significance. But on the other hand, if you can't get subjects and your study's not over, what are you going to do? So we did a lot of looking. We talked to the different patients that were in the process, different therapists who would be willing to go forward. And so we negotiated with FDA that we would end the study early with 90 people instead of 100. And that not all 90 had to go through the whole program if they wanted to end early. And so we came to agreement. We got the last data points in the middle of August, about a month ago, and we're doing the data monitoring, data queries, all of that to get the data in shape. Then you do data lock, then you do data analysis. So probably around October 20th or so, we're going to have the information whether our first of 2 phase 3 studies was significant. And we think it's likely to be. We're very hopeful, but we won't know until we look at the data. And we also think that our safety track record is quite good. We have started, as I put in the chat notes, our second phase 3 study. For the Montreal site is no longer going to be active because the therapists that work with Pedram are moving to Australia. But we do have a site in Vancouver. We have got 2 sites in Israel and then 11 sites throughout the United States. We've got about 5 or 6 up and running right now for MAP2 screening. And then over the next couple of months, we'll be layering in more. And we anticipate hopefully finishing everything around the early 2022, submitting it all to FDA, and then depending on how long their process is for review, end of 22, early 2023. Now, we're really trying to globalize as well. So we've already negotiated with the European Medicines Agency, and they've agreed that they will accept all the data from FDA, and we only need to do one 70-person study in Europe. And they made a special appeal to us that we include some refugees and migrants in the study, which we're very glad to do. And it's good that they recognize that you've got a bunch of traumatized people. How are they possibly going to adjust to their new life when they're just so suffering from trauma? And so we really hope to play. Now, we don't, of the 70, maybe hopefully, 7 or 10 or so will be refugees or migrants. We're going to have studies in Germany, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Portugal, Finland, Norway, and in England, United Kingdom, in London and in Cardiff. We've raised $2.3 million for that. We've gotten regulatory approvals in many of these countries. We're about to start enrolling subjects in the same project that Pedram was in, which is for the final training of the therapist, where they work with one person, open label, under supervision from our therapy training teams. And we do have to look and report the safety data, but the efficacy data doesn't count because it's only, there's no double blind. And so we're going to be running out of money sometime January or so. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait to see that the MAP1, our first phase 3 study, was statistically significant. If so, then the $30 million that we've raised, we think is going to be sufficient to get approval in FDA, again, if we get good results in MAP2. But approval in FDA, there's a lot of people that want to go second, but not a lot that want to go first. So the Health Canada and Ministry of Health in Israel are happy to go second after the FDA has said yes, but they're not going to go first. So we will submit applications, all three at the same time, but then we will negotiate with FDA and then see what happens. The other big thing I just want to share is that we, in addition to this project with Anne about MDMA for cognitive processing therapy, and hopefully this bigger one that she'll be doing more on her own with blending MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. We are doing some studies with blending MDMA with prolonged exposure with Ed Nafoa, who's in Israel, and also with Barbara Rothbaum, who's at Emory University. And what's going to be really important, which we haven't started yet, is exploring this idea of group therapy. And so that's going to be a new model that we want to develop to economize, to bring it to scale. And we've also been trying to, for 30 years, to start research inside the VA system. And so the FDA has just approved a project for inside a VA system, inside the Bronx VA, and we're waiting for the director to decide if she will permit it to be submitted to their IRB. The Loma Linda VA has got FDA approval and also their own IRB approval as well, and they're waiting for the state of California approval. So there's big breakthroughs happening, and I'll just respond to Michael just for a second, this question that we do want to publish MAP1 results in a journal before well before submitting the NDA to the FDA, because we want to be not only doing the research, but educating the scientific community, subjecting it to peer review, and then, generating support in the scientific community. And I'll just say one of the things that's super great is that Candace Monson, who's working with Anna on the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy study, is the president of the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, which is the largest organization in the world of PTSD researchers and therapists. So I think that this new year, as we're coming to it, is going to be a year of further breakthroughs. I'm very hopeful. And I think that if the COVID delays don't turn out to be longer than we've calculated for, we should have the money that we need for FDA, Health Canada, and the Ministry of Health in Israel.
And what's sort of your projected timeline for MDMA therapy becoming accessible outside of the US? Do you have one?
Well, yeah. Well, already we're doing studies, as I said, in Canada and in Israel. But we think that we're about a year behind in Europe. So that assuming that we do raise this additional money for EMA and globalization, we're hoping that near the end of 2023, we'll have approval from the European Medicines Agency. Now, it's a little bit different in that you also need to get the National Healthcare Services to agree to pay for it. I mean, you can still have self-pay, and we, of course, have to do the same thing in the US with insurance companies. So we're just at the stage of having our first cost effectiveness studies about to be published in PLOS ONE in the open access journal. And it was not just cost effective, but cost savings in the long run. We're training therapists starting actually this month. There's a training in conjunction with Naropa, which is Naropa University in Boulder. And we have therapists that are being trained now from Somaliland, Kenya, South Africa. So we're working to bring MDMA to traumatized populations in Africa. There's been a small study already in Brazil. There's other interests in Argentina, Colombia. So we're also working with people in Australia. But I think that as far as approvals, what we have in Israel is pretty important in that they've given permission for what's called open access, compassionate access. So that kind of is called expanded access in the US. So that runs in parallel with phase 3 because there's so many people that have PTSD, but only a few can be in the study. So you can have a parallel track as long as it doesn't slow down your phase 3 for expanded access. So that's been already approved by the Ministry of Health in Israel. In Canada, there's been some new developments recently where there was a rule that if it was a Schedule 1 drug like MDMA or psilocybin, you couldn't get compassionate use. But several people now have gotten it for psilocybin for people with, I think, cancer patients with anxiety, facing life-threatening illnesses. So we're hoping that there'll be expanded access in Canada sometime fairly soon for MDMA. And then it'll roll out over the next couple of years. And then just to paint a super optimistic picture, I'll say that from the clinic, the Awaken clinic that Ben is trying to work on, Remedy clinic that Anna's going to do, that these will be models, but there will eventually be hundreds and then thousands of these clinics that will be rolled out across the world. And I think we'll have a decade of that. So let's say by 2033, 2034, there'll be 4,000, 5,000 clinics all over the world, hopefully, with all these trained therapists. And then people will, voters in all these different countries will have a different perspective on psychedelics. They won't run away from the word psychedelic the way that Ben is not doing that. And I think we'll not only have medical access, but we will then have drug policy reform and have access for people to learn how to heal themselves or treat themselves earlier after a trauma or do peer support. So I think we'll have these parallel systems of public education, honest public education, harm reduction information, access to pure drugs, people using it under a licensed legalization system that we can maybe discuss further. And then they'll have the medical route through all the clinics covered by insurance. And there's so much suffering going on that there'll be more than enough for all of these outcomes. So I think by 2035, we'll have licensed legalization, and then we'll start to really spread kind of mental health throughout the world's population.
Can I add on to that for a second?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Great. So yeah, one thing when I think about that future possibility, there's actually one thing I'm excited with the couples therapy is because we're collecting data on someone who doesn't have PTSD or any other mental health condition when they're going through these treatments. And so I think that's really exciting and hopeful that we've had approvals to be able to do that, and that can actually pave the way, for example, to couples therapy without an indication of PTSD and use that as the gateway into that. But then we can be developing these safety and efficacy profiles for the use of MDMA. It's still in a therapeutic context, but not necessarily having to have a particular disorder and going forward from there. So that was one thing that clicked for me when, Rick was talking about the future and what that could look like in 10 years or so.
Can I just add a thing as well about the UK perspective from what Rick said? On the one hand, it's really exciting to hear things like end of 2023. On the other hand, that's so far away. And I have all kinds of tricks up my sleeve to get MDMA available to the British public sooner than that. I think the concept of the expanded access or the compassionate use, I've been reaching out to people. I reached out to Prince Harry recently, who has a combat PTSD history, and I was asked to make a 12 bullet point statement for him to try and get a 5-minute audience with him to see if we can appeal to him on that level. There's also a lot of work being done with psilocybin for expanded access and compassionate use in the UK. And I will not be satisfied to have to wait till 2023 for full EMA approval. There are also other mechanisms. As a psychiatrist, I've prescribed other psychiatric drugs that have had FDA license but not EMA license. There is a mechanism to do that. So I don't think I'm hoping that I personally, as a doctor, am not going to have to wait for full EMA approval before we can find a mechanism to have MDMA therapy in the UK. But it's a very long and slow road. And every time I speak to Rick, it seems to get 6 months longer rather than 6 months shorter. But,
that's the sad truth.
But, that's the sad truth, yeah. So I'm optimistic that there are sneaky mechanisms to get things moving faster than waiting for the full FDA and EMA approval, as we've seen in other countries and as we've seen with other drugs, as we've seen with cannabis, as we've seen with ketamine. Ketamine is not being used as a licensed treatment in psychiatry other than S-ketamine. Cannabis is being prescribed all over the world without a proper FDA license and without RCTs. So I do think that there are sneaky mechanisms, and so there should be, because it's immoral and unethical for patients to have to wait for something that has plenty of proven safety and efficacy.
Yeah.
So I do think
I'll just say, if you and I combine our sneaky qualities, we should be able to help you start something sooner in England.
I mean, it's not really sneaky. There's a stigma here against it. As you've said, it's a very common thing, say in oncology drugs, that whilst drugs are in phase 3, they are pushed forward and can be used compassionately, because it's quite clear that populations of patients shouldn't have to wait if safety and efficacy has been adequately demonstrated. And I do think that we're up against a bit of a stigma that these are kind of psychedelic drugs. If we can try and push that forward, that this population of patients, it's immoral and unethical for them to have to wait another 3 to 5 years, then I do think there are mechanisms. And obviously we don't do anything that's illegal. It's all with a full approval, but there are ways to push it. And my experience, say, with cannabis is people power is the strongest possible thing, patient power. It's something I found very frustrating. So myself and David Nutt have been lobbying successive governments for 20 years to do something about cannabis in this country, putting reams of research onto Home Secretaries' desks of all this evidence-based data. And it's got absolutely nowhere until in 2018, a couple of sick kids with epilepsy get on the front page of the tabloid press, and then within a couple of months, cannabis medicine's available. So this is what we need to do. Although I am a scientist and I'm driven by data and science, I think there are other stronger forces in this world that can get things done. So we push ahead with all this data collection and the proper science, but trust me, a couple of good frontline headlines with the likes of Prince Harry behind them could push things forward faster than our current mechanisms. So I think we need to be creative with that.
Stories over science.
Yeah.
Or stories and science, I think.
would love to do. That's why I'm here. And that's, I think, for someone like me, is the only thing I can bring. I'm not going to bring the data and the science. And I think in this space, actually, it's missing. The stories of healings, the stories of sufferings, both of it, I feel that it needs to be more out there. So that's one thing I hope to do more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think your story is, it's powerful for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons it's powerful is that you didn't even know you had PTSD, right? Which I think speaks to how common mental health conditions are in our society. People don't even know what it is that they're dealing with. I'm curious to know a little bit more, Pedram. My understanding, and maybe one of the other panelists wants to chime in here too, but my understanding is that you only are eligible for a trial if you have treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning not true. Okay.
Well, in phase 2, it was all treatment resistant. Because we needed to work with the hardest cases. But then we negotiated with the FDA for phase 3. And what they said in phase 3, that if you require treatment resistance, they will only approve it for people who are treatment resistant. So phase 3 is not, but expanded access, and in Israel, open access is only for treatment resistance, because the idea there that it's compassionate use for people who have failed other treatments, and therefore they need access to something before it's fully approved. And they can do that at their own risk, and they also have to pay for it unless we can raise money to subsidize it. So expanded access is treatment resistant. Phase 2 was treatment resistant, but phase 3 is not, in pursuit of this idea that once it's approved, we want to work with this as a first line treatment. It doesn't, the risks are not so great that we need to wait for people to have failed other things.
Pedram, can you share a little bit more about your experience of being in the trial? What you said that you went through a long screening process. I see a lot of people here in the chat are interested in knowing more about how do you get into a trial? What does that process look like? So what was that like for you?
I think it was one of the hardest things I've ever done, both when it comes to the paperwork that needed to be done and the emotional toll that it can take on you. There were moments that I wanted to give up, and this is back to the work that Annie's doing. Is like I think this is something I wanted to put out there. It's like the role of my partner. I don't think anybody suffered as much as she did when it comes to my condition. And so seeing that there's actually that was one study that made me jealous. I thought I was in the best study in the world when I found out about Anza study. I was like, oh, that's where I should have been. Like I totally wish my wife could have done this with me. Although I would say that probably I would have needed to have my own sessions and then have sessions with her. I don't know if all with her would have worked. But for me, that's one thing that I want to see more of, like the support that comes with the partners as you go through that. So I think it was definitely her support, making sure that I don't give up, because there were times that I was like, especially when you have to do, because you meet with a therapist, you start building a relationship, that all goes well. But then during the process, you have to meet with these other random therapists that they all have to meet with you, like 2 hours Zoom calls. And then they all have to go through the whole process with you. And then they have to say like, yes, basically what the therapists are saying is correct. And those were the hardest for me, just sitting in front of a computer, talking to a random stranger who knows nothing about me. I've never met them before. And then here they are asking me, what kind of trauma did I experience and what was it like? And so those were like, I remember every time after those, I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. And then it wasn't one. I think I had to do 3 of those. Yeah. So yeah, it was definitely hard, but like everything that it's hard, it's worth it by the end. So obviously I have zero regrets. But once the process actually started, and I think the very first MDMA session was kind of when I was like, wow, like one thing mentally, I think intellectually, I was like, I'm on the right way. And then I started actually feeling it in my body. I was completely out of touch with my body. So I was just all the way up here. And it was the first MDMA session that made me actually feel safe in my own skin. Like I just remembered how it feels to be safe again. And that feeling is something I carry with me today, like I think that's I think that's the unfair advantage of this sort of treatment, is that once you experience it, like like suicidal thoughts would come up, but I could remember how it feels to be alive. So then I was like, no, now I remember. Before I never remembered that. So thoughts would come up and I'm like, yeah, those thoughts are valid because I don't even remember how to feel good anymore. So once I had the first one, then things definitely started to spiral upwards. Mm-hmm. I can go to more specifics if there are more specific questions, obviously.
There's people in the chat are saying, acknowledging your bravery, acknowledging your courage for participation. So just want to acknowledge that as well. A lot of folks in the audience, they're saying you have a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. A lot of folks have also been asking about how they get trained to become a therapist. So can someone on the panel address that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that, as Ben talked about the ketamine infusion farms, that the treatment is not the drug. The treatment is therapy, and the therapy is enhanced by the drug and made more possible. So therefore, in our negotiations with the regulatory agencies, what they're coming to believe and what we anticipate being required after approval is that the only people that can prescribe the drug and the only people that can treat patients are those that have been trained in the therapy. Now, there will be a separate training shorter for prescribers, doctors who just want to do medical screenings. They don't need to go through all the therapy training if they don't want to actually be therapists. So there'll be a shorter training for prescribers. If prescribers also want to be therapists, they have to go through the therapy training program. And so I just put on the chat. So it's maps.org/training for details about the training program. And so one of the things that we have, we've got a 5-part training program. The first part is online. You learn about PTSD, you learn about MDMA, you learn a little bit about our treatment method. You watch some videos. Then in the past, it's been all in person, but there's a 5-day residential program for 50 people or so. They live together at a special place, and we show mostly videotapes of therapy sessions, and then we discuss them. Then we have an opportunity for people to volunteer to receive MDMA if they're therapists. And that's been, according to the therapist, tremendously useful. But we're struggling with the FDA right now about expanding that. So it's not clear how we're going to do that, but we are working with, hopefully Ben will set up a center at his center, Awaken, to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. We're working with people in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic, and in Israel to try to set this up. I had a conversation with Andy Weil the other day from Integrative Medicine. He's talking about the possibility, at least of part of their education, they would set up some sort of phase 1 study of looking at immune system parameters or something scientific, and then that would be for therapists to get their training. We then have role play where people have to videotape themselves doing role playing, and it's amazing how people get into the role play. And then we, give them feedback from our therapy training program. And then the final part, which was the study that Pedram was in, is this whole question of treating a patient under supervision and then getting feedback about the method. And sometimes we'll say to people after just one session, you're doing fine, or we watch 2 sessions, or we watch 3. Sometimes we might say you need another patient even. But that's our training process. And we do 2-person therapy teams, usually male, female, but not always. But where we want to get to is this idea where it's one of the persons is a trained therapist, the other can be a student, an apprentice, working to get hours to get their own license, or possibly just being a massage therapist or a sound healer, or any number of different things that. So we don't even think they should have a bachelor's degree, but we're sort of going to be arguing with them about the credentials for the therapist. So the challenge is going to be to keep the 2-person model, which is, I think, better than the 1-person, not twice as good. But if we can keep the cost down, then we can roll out the 2-person model. And so and then for people that want to get trained, they can just sign up and read the website information, and you'll learn about it. The very next training is in November for Europeans that we're training for working on phase 3 in Europe, and a few others from around the world.
I can share some thoughts about training too, if I can add on to that, Rick, as someone who went through the MAPS training when it was first being developed. So it was before there was actually a training program. I had started doing some of this work with Annie and Michael, and so I was at their house, Annie and Michael Mithofer, and I was at their house as they were developing it, and it's been amazing seeing the training grow. And so one thing as someone who has now brought my own team to be trained and supervising them, and as a trainer in training, one of the things that I think is really important at this stage, especially with the person who's going to be kind of the primary therapist, if you will, the key thing is to be a really good therapist. And so that goes without saying that needs to be there first. And so a background in psychotherapy and feeling grounded in that and feeling like that those people are doing their own work is extremely important within this as well. And so it's the thing with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is that you're going into the shadow places with folks at a much faster rate than you necessarily would be in another psychotherapy. So I think it's extremely important that people who are interested in doing this type of work understand that and feel comfortable doing that for themselves so that they know what they're about to step into. Because a lot can get stirred up in those sessions, and a lot is stirred up for both the therapist and the clients. And so, as Pedram was saying, right, those assessment sessions that he was doing in between the therapy sessions, those are huge components that get stirred up because you're being asked about those questions. So even as the therapist, understanding that afterwards, then you're going to meet with the client and know that it's all been stirred up after having been asked those questions. And that's an extremely important part of it. So I get asked this question a lot, especially locally, going like, oh, where can I get trained in this? And what I always say first is be a really good therapist. Read, like Pedram did, read everything, watch all the videos, right? And then when the opportunity arises to come into these training programs, you'll be really well set up to be able to do that. And you get to go into depth and really get to watch, videos of the trials and learn some of the technique. But it's like there's a stance and an ethos around it, plus therapy skill, plus a bit of information about MDMA. I think those are the key pieces that go together.
And if I can add one thing, if they have trauma experience, even better.
Yes, 100%. If you're working with PTSD.
It's definitely something for me that I think I already had a lack of trust. That was a big thing for me that I had really hard time trusting. And even I think halfway through the story, I always had this feeling, I'm like, well, what do these people know about trauma? Right. Like I didn't know anything about them, but it was just, this feeling was always there. I'm like, do they really know about my pain? Can you learn about this sort of pain in academia? I don't think so. Like they were very lovely people, obviously. And then later on, I found out, obviously, everybody has some sort of trauma experience, but being able to, obviously being in control of it and having done your own healing work and openly being able to talk about it, I think it builds a lot of empathy, to know that, okay, now you're working with somebody who really feels your pain.
Right.
Not intellectually, but on a soul-to-soul level.
Yeah, I mean, and this issue is really important because it comes up so much. I get, like Anne and Rick, I get so many people contacting me saying, oh, Ben, I want to be a psychedelic therapist. And I say, why? And they say, because I love taking LSD. You know, it's like, that does not set you up to be a good psychedelic therapist. You know, you should say, I want to be a psychedelic therapist because I want to work with people with PTSD and depression and trauma and child abuse and eating disorders. And I've spent years working in hospitals, in wards, in police stations, in people's homes, in school play yards, you know, and being the best possible clinical therapist. Now, that doesn't have to be a medical doctor. That can be a clinical psychologist, a psychotherapist, even an occupational therapist, even a physiotherapist, a social worker, or a nurse. Any of these clinical roles where you've spent years working in the patient-clinician dyad. You understand the issues of consent and confidentiality. You understand how clinical therapy works. And then you add psychedelic therapy as a specialist branch of therapy. You wouldn't kind of go up to a brain surgeon and say, oh, I'm really interested in brain surgery. Why can't I just do the training in 2 weeks? You know, quite rightly, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. And I think a lot of people find this difficult or disappointing to hear. But I think we do have to safeguard this. This is clinical therapy. This is difficult, tricky patients. And using complex psychopharmacology like psychedelics on top of that is another layer of specialism. And we do need to safeguard that just having an interest in psychedelics is great, but it's not enough. Because like everyone said on the panel, when you're really up against it with a difficult patient, with a traumatic dissociative experience, doesn't matter how much LSD you might have done in the past, how many times have you worked with a patient with trauma in that situation without psychedelics? That's what really equips you. Now, on the other hand, the caveat to this, as Rick says, is this mechanism because it's a pair, we can have the situation where one of you can be a trained clinician, registered clinician, and the other one doesn't have to be. They could be a student or in training. But I think we have to be really careful not to allow this to be watered down and to get to this point 5 years from now or 10 years from now where people have become calling themselves clinicians on the basis purely of their psychedelic work. I do think you have to be a clinician first in order to be good at this and to manage it, because that's going to safeguard you much more than however many trips you might have taken in the past.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just add something onto the therapist dyad piece, which I think is important, because one thing we're testing in the study, the upcoming study we're doing, is having one primary therapist who's doing the psychotherapy component and then having 2 therapists in the actual MDMA session, essentially as safeguarding as backup. And one thing that we are very firmly adhering to is it does not need to be a male-female dyad, mostly because there are many gender expressions and we feel clearly that that's not something we want to adhere to. And because we want to demonstrate going forward that, you know, at some point, hopefully it could be a choice for the client what type of therapist dyad they might have in that session. So I think that's really important. But also the other thing that really, you know, as someone who believes strongly in this modality, like I think there's such potential for healing. And I was one of the lucky participants as a therapist who got to have my own MDMA therapy session early on. In fact, that's what convinced me to do this research to begin with, because I had zero experience with psychedelics prior to that. I think I know there's immense potential, and I've seen it in my clients in terms of their healing and growth. And I think it's one door to potential healing, for example, with PTSD. So that's, you know, what I treat the vast majority of the time is PTSD. And I see this as being one tool in the toolkit to be able to treat PTSD. And it really, I want choice for my clients, and I want them to have the ability to say, once they know what's going on, you know, like in Pedram's experience going like, oh, I didn't know I had that, right? Once they understand, like once there's a understanding of what's happening, to go, okay, here are some different options. What's appealing? Because for some folks, it's not going to be MDMA, or maybe they want to try something else first. And so that it's a piece of a full puzzle in terms of what good care looks like.
I'll just say that I'm putting in the chat a link to an article that Anne wrote with Annie Mithofer about breaking the gender mold and our first 2 female team.
Yeah, it was great. Annie and I got to sit together for some couples in the couple study, and it was really amazing working together.
So you kind of hinted at this, and the various modalities for treating PTSD. I know that Rick is also mentioned he's been working on combination studies that look at both MDMA therapy and prolonged exposure, which for folks who don't know is sort of the gold standard treatment for therapy at VAs. Oftentimes is sort of the first line of defense. And so can you both talk about, and of course Ben and Pedram chime in too, about what you're seeing in terms of doing MDMA, doing MDMA. I don't know what kind of therapy actually you do, integration therapy you do in the FDA studies now, but doing that versus doing MDMA with CPT or with prolonged exposure.
Yeah, sure. I can take a stab at this one to start. So the model that's being used in the phase 3 studies and what's part of the MAPS training program is an inner-directed supportive psychotherapy model that goes alongside the administration of MDMA. And so what that means is it's really driven by the experience of the participant in their MDMA therapy session, and it brings in the best skills of the clinician in preparation and integration. And so I think that's fantastic, especially if people have had a lot of experience working with trauma, right? You get to bring in all these different components, all of these, what I actually think would be a very holistic treatment of PTSD, if you're thinking about the cognitive, the emotional, the behavioral, the somatic, all those pieces. And, you know, one thing we're talking about in terms of with the therapist training program is even thinking about modularly going forward, like having all these different components come in, but they're not prescribed, right? There's no particular saying like, you must do this, or touch in these areas. So you compare that to the types of treatments that we're testing right now in the pilots, where there is a bit more of a rubric of going, okay, make sure that you've checked in on this particular area. And so, for example, with cognitive processing therapy, there's an emphasis on meaning making. And that's kind of the crux of the therapy, is how do you understand what's happened to you and how that means now and what that means going forward. So there's a checking in, and it's still completely client-centered in terms of it's the client's experience that's the content of what you're talking about. There's just a little bit more of a frame or a structure around, and ask about meaning making, or ask about how do you make sense of what's happened. So that's the same for the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. With the couples therapy, there's the added piece of communication skills, which I think is central. And the couples talk about being very useful, that to be able to talk together about what's happening, you need to be on the same page about how do you talk about it and how do you disclose what's happened? Because that can be a huge piece for couples, that maybe one person actually doesn't know what's happened or is scared to know, or the other person's going to try to protect them. So to have communication skills that they both understand and have both practiced is a central piece up front, as well as how do you deal with anger or arguments when they come up as well. So some real tools and skills there before moving into the meaning making. So it's, you know, every form of psychotherapy has a slightly different take. And my perspective is they're all trying to get to the same place, and usually they're all correct. And it's just more kind of what door fits for you, what appeals, and then going through that one.
Can I add something on top of that?
Of course.
Yeah. So this is for me. I know the protocol is mainly based on IFS method, which I think it was thanks to that method that I discovered the inner dictator inside of me, which also I realized it was just a leader who was scared and didn't trust anybody. So it was actually not a dictator. And then I told him basically you can retire now and just be a normal leader. And that came thanks to IFS, right? But one thing that on top of that really, I think for me was powerful was because I had read The Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl many years before that. And then halfway through the study, I grabbed the book again, I'm reading it. And obviously he talks about logotherapy, right? I don't know if more people actually read the end of the book, because that's when I started geeking out about psychotherapy. So I was interested in reading that. So basically I realized that my suffering was actually gave me meaning in life. I realized all my life I was looking for this sense of meaning through work, pleasure, relationships, all things that were actually outside of me, all things that one day they were gone, right? So there was this job I really loved, and then the manager changed. There goes the meaning of my life. There was this woman who I was in love with. We got a divorce. There goes the meaning of my life, right? So I realized all my life I was just losing this sense of meaning until I was like, wow, my suffering is mine. No one can take this away from me. This is mine. Like I started actually turning things around. But oh, this is no longer a bad thing. This can actually be the reason why I'm alive. This can actually be a reason why I should do this healing work, because I found meaning in my own suffering, right? It's like I had read it in a book, but I started experiencing it. And I think this is something that I would love to see in the future, that, okay, it's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, but giving more power or control to patients to be able to choose some of these frameworks that works better for them, right? So for example, maybe they could walk them through, oh, this is what IFS looks like, this is what logotherapy looks like, this is what CBT looks like, what resonates more with your story, and bring on, including talking about story, the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. I think that's one powerful way also bringing that into psychotherapy, you know, stoicism. There's so many other things that you could mix it, which I was doing on my own, but it was definitely not part of the protocol that I think in future it can be.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I hear what you're saying, and I want to add to that, because I love it when I get this question, what kind of psychotherapy model are you using with your alcohol study? And my very lazy answer is we're using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treating alcohol use disorder method. And we're making it up as we go along, because the truth is it's not been done. And I think that over the last 10, 15 years with psychedelic therapies, we've had a lot of psychological input. Is it a bit like CBT? Is it a bit like trauma exposure therapy? Is it a bit like DBT? Is it a bit like IFS? At the end of the day, it's actually none of these things. And nor do we have to try and pretend it's any of these things. If we fast forward psychedelic research 15, 20 years from now, it will just be called MDMA therapy for eating disorders, MDMA therapy for alcoholism. And we wouldn't have to pretend it's a little bit like this and a little bit like that. But it's because we're in the infancy, and I guess regulatory authorities, they want you to put something on the form to say, what is your psychological model? So you kind of have to make it fit into existing models. But I completely agree with what you're saying. I mean, this for me goes to a much deeper point about actually eroding the whole concept of categorical psychiatric diagnoses. You know, not only is there not one single therapy that fits, but there's no diagnosis that fits. I've been a psychiatrist for 20 years. I've never met a patient with depression or PTSD or eating disorders or personality disorders or addictions or schizophrenia or bipolar. I don't know what those people are like. I've met thousands of totally individual idiosyncratic people that just do not fit into categorical diagnoses. And I think psychedelics have a really important role to play, not just in providing these new treatments, but in tackling the whole way we approach and diagnose and label and categorize people with mental health issues, because none of them fit into these boxes from a diagnostic point of view. And so that means none of them should have an out-of-the-box treatment that fits them. Their treatments should be patient-driven, they should be bespoke, they should be designed according to not just their psychiatric symptoms, but where they live, their race, their gender, their age, their house, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, their children, their family, their education, their parenting. You know, there is no single categorical diagnosis that fits anyone. And so there's no single treatment. But, you know, that's me being a little bit kind of crazy maybe, because the truth is, in order to set up research protocols, you've got to try and fit these into these boxes. And you know, things like IFS fit really well. So we are sort of shoeholing the psychedelic therapies into something to make it work. But I really look forward to the future when they will stand alone on their own without having to be like something else.
Thank you for that point. A number of people have asked about MDMA for, as Bob Jesse puts it, the betterment of well people. Can someone on the panel address that a little bit?
Well, I'll start. I'll say Anne's already started talking about that in terms of, you know, the second person in cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, the one that has the relationship with somebody that has PTSD. But what Bob is talking about requires drug policy reform. The kind of things that we're going to be getting through the FDA are for treatment of diagnosable disorders. It's not clear at all that the FDA would ever approve MDMA for couples therapy. despite the great evidence that we could be getting from the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy about the improvement of the relationships that runs along with the reduction in PTSD in the person with PTSD. So that the kind of things that we can do research in MDMA for couples therapy. We could do research with that right now. We can do research with MDMA for spirituality or for meaning of life or any of these things, but we have limited resources. So what is the political leverage for those things? It doesn't lead to approved drugs, new contexts for delivery of therapy, but the new context for delivery of therapy changed people's minds and they lead towards more support for drug policy reform. So I think we have to sequence what we're trying to do as we take a world, populations that have been fed vast amounts of misinformation, that are scared of these drugs, that have been criminalized, driven underground. We're trying to do that. But I think that the end goal is mass mental health, which means moving beyond both medical and religious contexts for religious freedom for certain things, to provide people with this access under a licensed legalization system that Ben thinks hopefully he can help us figure out before 2035.
Ben has already eloquently established, and he got lots of hurrahs in the chat about sort of the arbitrary diagnostic system that's currently in place. That being said, it is in place. And I know that all of you have done a lot of really important thinking and work around MDMA for conditions other than PTSD. Ben, in particular, you're working on a study using MDMA to treat alcoholism. So can some of you address what are sort of the next conditions on the list that you're hoping to investigate and use this medicine for?
Well,
yeah,
I was going to say it's interesting hearing people talk. There's a lot of stuff about eating disorders and anorexia nervosa at the moment. We're actually currently designing a study to use psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to treat obesity. Anorexia nervosa is a really interesting disorder. It's very difficult to treat, and it's certainly in need of reformation in terms of treatments, but it's actually pretty rare. You know, it's like, what, less than 1%, 2% of the population? Obesity affects 30% of the population. And one of the things that we're doing with our new research unit is to be targeting big public health things, really big things, not just rare psychiatric disorders, but stuff that has a real impact on the mental health of the mental and physical health of vast numbers of people. So I think that's where I'd like to see research going in the next few years, going towards really big things that affect large numbers of people and are large public health burdens.
So what we've done, sorry.
Can I dovetail, Rick, and then I'll throw it over to you? Yeah. So also speaking of large impact, so I'm going to be a broken record, not only couples therapy, but relational healing. So it could be really between any two people who are closely involved with each other. I think of parent-child, I think of siblings, I think of even close friends, right, who've gone through or just living their lives in tandem, right? So I think that the power of MDMA, and we see that historically, like MDMA was historically used in couples therapy. It was historically used in this context. So that to me is, we're gonna have to find a way, Rick, to get it approved later. But as the next research, like that's where I see there being a ton of benefit and also a lot of interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very much, yeah. I'll say, so we've done MDMA for social anxiety. Charlie Grobe and Alicia Danforth, small pilot study, but great results. We've done MDMA to help people with life-threatening illnesses with anxiety about it. But I think that the area that is not been explored yet, that is going to be tremendously important, is in this mind-body connection. So MDMA for fibromyalgia, MDMA therapy for irritable bowel syndrome. There's a whole host of what we think of as physical diseases that have a mind-body connection to them. And so we've yet to really start in any systematic way looking at those. But there's a lot of anecdotal reports of people that have done MDMA on their own or other psychedelics on their own and helped them with a whole range of conditions that have physical manifestations. So I think trying to figure out the mind-body connection, how you sort of mobilize the placebo effect at will instead of by, people have shown recently that you can be told that you're getting a placebo and it still can be helpful, even if you know. So we need to go beyond that into like consciously being able to catalyze our immune system to do certain things. So I think that that's going to be a really important area of research going forward.
Ben, can you talk a little more about MDMA for substance use and alcoholism?
Yeah, sure, briefly. So we were looking for a donor to give us some money to do an MDMA PTSD neuroimaging study about 5 years ago. And then this donor said to me, I'm not going to give you money for that. What about if I give you 4 times that amount of money? What would you do differently? I said, wow, well, I'm not a big fan of imaging. And Rick's already got PTSD nailed down. So if you were to give me a large amount of money, I would choose something completely new. And I was working in adult addictions at the time. And I'm really interested in alcoholism. And I know that alcoholism, like most addictions, has high levels of trauma underlying it. So we kind of put 2 and 2 together and came up with 5 and thought maybe MDMA-assisted psychotherapy would work for alcoholism because of the strong trauma component. Now, when you look at the history of psychedelics treating addictions, that it's all classic psychedelics. Going right back to the 50s, the first work with LSD was all around alcohol. Most of the LSD studies in the late 50s and early 60s were around alcohol. So, and then more recently, we've had psilocybin for alcohol addiction and nicotine addiction. We've had ketamine treatment for opiate and alcohol and addictions. So, but what all of these classic psychedelic studies for addictions have had in common is it's when you blow the patient's mind with this mystical spiritual experience, that seems to lead on to a natural sobriety. Now, when we started with MDMA, MDMA doesn't classically do that. About 5 to 10% of first dose, threshold dose MDMA users will report a mystical godlike experience. Nothing like the 80 to 90 you'll get with LSD or psilocybin. So we thought maybe it's not going to work for that reason because MDMA doesn't tend to do that. But what we found was it really did do that. People talk very much about this kind of very peak experience, psychedelic type experience on the MDMA in our alcohol study. We thought we were going to be talking much more about index trauma, but we tended to see this kind of mystical spiritual experience, which was really interesting. So what we did is we took patients, it was an open label safety and tolerability study, so no placebo control group, which might sound very methodologically unsound, but you have to do that when it's a first drug new condition. We took 14 alcohol-dependent patients in Bristol, took them all down to 0 through a medical detox. So they were all drinking between 60 and 300 units of alcohol a week. They came all the way down to 0. And then they came into our 8-week MDMA course, which was 2 sessions with MDMA sandwiched between non-drug sessions. And we followed them up to 9 months. Now, we did a treatment as usual group. So it wasn't the same study, they weren't randomized, but we looked at the treatment as usual in Bristol before that. And at 9 months, 86% of the patients had returned to full levels of drinking after detox without MDMA. With MDMA, after 9 months, 12% had returned to full levels of drinking. Now that's a staggering result. That's what I call a Mithoff miracle result, which requires repetition, and we need someone to repeat that. But a staggering result, just blows out of the water the current best treatments for alcoholism. And just really interesting to do because it was a tricky population to work with. They've got quite a lot of physical illness. They have quite a lot of social dysfunction often. So pinning people down to stay in a kind of 12-month research study was really interesting. But yeah, really, really proud of that result. And it was the first MDMA clinical study outside of MAPS in terms of sponsorship, but tremendous support both academically and through lots and lots of connection with the staff at MAPS. So we were really pleased with that. But for me, it's part of a bigger thing. It's about pushing it away from PTSD. And like Rick says, just broadening it. We've seen psychedelic research fall into these kind of pigeonholes in recent years with ketamine for depression, psilocybin for TRD, psilocybin for anxiety, MDMA for PTSD. The way I see it, right, is this. Any condition in psychiatry that responds to psychotherapy will respond to psychedelic psychotherapy, any condition. So this is everything from eating disorders to schizophrenia. It's, if you can use psychotherapy to treat the condition, you can use MDMA or psilocybin psychotherapy. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next few years. More and more interesting diagnoses, broadening. I love the idea of IBS, Rick. That's fantastic. I have so many patients with IBS and fibromyalgia, and they're really hard to treat. So I think we're going to see this broadening. And I think that hopefully there's going to be a lot more brave researchers out there who don't just repeat what Compass are doing with psilocybin and depression, or what MAPS are doing with MDMA and PTSD, but start coming up with new, novel things. If it responds to a therapist, it'll respond to a psychedelic therapist.
Yeah, now, just in terms of new, novel things, we have a whole program that's called Investigator-Initiated Trials, IITs. And what that means is that people come to us with an idea for MDMA research, and we can work with them where they're the sponsor. We don't necessarily have the resources to pay for all these studies, but we can provide the MDMA, often for free. We can help them cross-reference all of our data at the FDA or Health Canada or whichever country they're doing it. And we've now got about 70 different collaborations with research teams. Now, a lot of these are just initial inquiries. None of them have matured yet to a new study. But they're people that want to have a special idea that they want to study. Some of them are looking at recently released people from prison to see if they can help deal with the trauma that would reduce recidivism. A whole range of things. There's someone that wants to combine MDMA with EMDR for PTSD in Native American populations. There's a whole range of different things. So I would encourage people, if they have ideas, like if somebody wanted to do an IBS, irritable bowel syndrome MDMA project, it doesn't have to be sponsored by us. We can help you be your own sponsor. We can provide all the assistance that we can, and we have absolutely no demand to own the intellectual property. We do want it, if they're working with us, for at least these early studies to be made public. So it's not quite the same as working with investors, but at the same time, we'd love to help people. So if anybody has these ideas, they could just write to Valerie@mapsbcorp.com, and we can establish initial collaboration.
That's great to know. I'm sure a lot of people will be interested. Maybe you want to drop that email address in the chat so folks have that correctly. And we only have about 5 more minutes, and we haven't even talked about access yet. And a lot of people have asked, Antonio asks, how can we make MDMA therapy affordable and accessible for everybody, especially poor and marginalized communities? Group therapy, maybe. So can you folks address that?
Yeah, I'll just say super quickly, the insurance coverage is the way, and then also drug policy reform and getting it so that people can treat themselves, because otherwise it is expensive, and there's no way around that. And how do we get it to people that don't have insurance? Well, that's a big issue as well, particularly in America, which is heartless in our health policy. So I think that helping people heal themselves, also marginalized populations, what that requires is therapists from those populations. So we're trying to train therapists from all different populations as well.
I agree with that and as we're waiting for, or as the wheels move in drug policy reform, and hopefully we'll get there, at Remedy, we actually have a model that we're intending to use immediately for when it's available. So we'd have, folks who, if they have insurance or if they're able to pay out of pocket, could access it through the clinic. But we also have a not-for-profit that we've just started. And so in the not-for-profit that we're applying for charitable status, people will be able to donate so that other people would be able to access the treatment. And that way the therapists are paid, and then the client themselves would not have to pay for it. So that's our stopgap solution of trying to make sure that people will be able to access it immediately when they're able to.
Ben, you leaned forward. Were you going to say something?
No, I'm trying to attach a graph, but I can't seem to do it. I wanted to attach our final slide comparing the alcohol with MDMA without, but it's not a way of doing it.
Well, so we just have a few more minutes here. If folks want to look you up, they want to learn more about what you're doing, they want to get in touch with you, how can they do that? And do you have any parting words of wisdom? Let's start with you, Anne.
Sure, yeah. So for more updates about our work, you can go to remedycenter.ca, and I'll put that in the chat. We have a sign-up list specifically about information about the study, because we often have people who are asking us about that. We're not recruiting right now, given COVID, but hopefully we'll be soon. And parting words. I mean, I think I love the panel is called "The Future of MDMA," and I think we've really covered a gamut of things today, and it's exciting to think about the possibilities in both the grand scheme, but also the small steps in the future of what that's going to look like. So I'm also thanks everyone for joining us, and especially in this online format. I know it's a different way of having this conference when we all usually enjoy being together here in Toronto. So thanks.
Pedram?
I just want to publicly thank Rick, Ben, and it's people like you that I get a chance to live again. So I every time I have a chance to say that publicly, I want to do that. So that's the number one. Thank every therapist in the world, everyone who has an interest. I just wanted you to know that every time you have a hard time, you want to give up, just think of people on the other side, that how much we need these sort of treatments. And then last thing I want to add in there is that I want to share my story. I want to do whatever I can to obviously bring more awareness to this work. So if anybody's out there, I'm just starting to come out of the psychedelic closet. So if somebody wants to have me interviewed on podcasts, anywhere, I'm starting to build this confidence to actually go out there and share this story, raise more awareness. And also lastly, on the psychedelic patient experience design, that's something that I came up with that I thought that's probably somewhere I can add a lot of value. So like be a champion for the patients and go out there and just bring a little bit more of like what it feels to be on the other side. And if I can do that for the rest of my life, I'll be happy, because I don't think I can go back to the old me. It's just like this has become my life. So I'm constantly trying to find ways to do more in this space. So I'm always open to all opportunities.
Mm.
And for the refugee studies, Rick, I'm putting this out there. Anything I can do in Europe for that would be a dream. So
terrific, Pedram. Yeah, we'll call on you once we're ready for that. That would be great.
Absolutely.
Looks like Germany and the Netherlands may be the countries most likely to have access to refugees that we can work with.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rick, anything else you'd like to add? Contact information?
Well, if anybody wants to just, there's an enormous amount of information, maps.org, our treatment manual, summaries of all of our review of the scientific literature, all things like that. But I think that for words of wisdom, I'd like to go back to what Pedram said, which was that it's not just healing is not just a short-term thing, it's a process. And I think that's one of the most important things to people to think about, that we think about psychedelics, miracle cures, one dose and everything's different. And even with psychedelics, it's still hard and it still takes time. And so I don't want people to get disappointed. Oh, I've had one session and now I'm still struggling. It takes time. And I think the thing that we're the most proud of in a way is that the results that we get at the 2-month follow-up, which is what FDA is going to look at, comparing the control group and the experimental group, are good. But the results at the 12-month follow-up, which is after we've stopped doing anything, at the 2-month follow-up, people are on their own. So whatever happens, we can't say it's just because of MDMA, because they could have done any number of different things. But the results keep getting better. People they've learned a process of dealing with their trauma, and now they can do it on their own. And that's really this idea, is that we want to empower people to be their own healers, because life is going to continue to throw challenging experiences at all of us. And so I'm very encouraged that so I think that's the big word of wisdom from me, but really borrowed from Pedram. It's really not a short-term thing, it's a process. And that definitely do it without the drug. That's the most important part. And
Ben?
Yeah, I think all I would say very briefly is, if you're kind of a young person getting involved in this, do not give up. There are those of us who've been doing it for a little while, but as I said, this whole subject is still in its infancy. We're talking about as if this is a thing. It's not a thing. These drugs still aren't even licensed. The future of psychedelic therapy is 5, 10, 15, 50 years away. We're still making it up as we go along on drugs that don't even have licenses yet. So it is not too late to be a pioneer in this subject. Those people who are just coming into it now are going to be the pioneers, not anyone else. So don't give up. stay focused on it, and focus on your patients, because they are why we do this. We do this because they work and they're safe and efficacious, and our patients deserve these treatments because traditional methods are not suiting them. So don't give up, keep going, and I look forward to learning from the next generation.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I know that Mapping the Mind has a lot more exciting programming coming up today, so stay tuned, and we will catch you all later. Thank you so much for joining.
Yes, thank you,
Thank
Shelby.
you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.